Thank you for joining us today. We have a lineup of additional talks that will be coming up in the future, and we look forward to having you join us for those. The Emergency Management and Community Resilience Program was born at Portland State out of a vision of our president to better serve the region and the nation in responding to the ever-increasing hazards and disasters in which we're experiencing. At first, this program was created responding to the idea of the big one and the Cascadia and other subduction zones and faults that are near us that we had not planned for since the mid-90s. But now, since COVID and the wildfires have come, this program has become even more timely. And what a great year for this program to be initiated. And I'm excited to be sharing it with all of you and presenting our faculty and their wonderful research so that our potential students and partners can better understand what we offer in this program. I want everyone to think about our program in relation to what we call a disaster resilience cycle. And it's got 4 different stages to it: preparation, relief, recovery, and mitigation. Our program hopes to engage all of these different aspects of what's called a disaster risk management cycle with proactive resilience thinking, such as mobilizing and engaging community during preparation, having informed immediate response and relief, equitably building back better and noticing whether or not root causes are being addressed in a recovery phase, and thinking about proactive opportunities to transform during mitigation. These are some of the values that our Emergency Management and Community Resilience Program has. And we apply those values and those different aspects of that cycle to the pedagogy and practice in which our program has. Our program is both rooted in skills and cutting-edge theoretical approaches. We're transdisciplinary, coming from 6 different disciplines: anthropology, communication, urban studies and planning, public administration, geography, and geology. And we're fed by the entire university with our elective courses through our master's degree. Our graduate certificate offers the best of our core curriculum coming from those 6 different disciplines, broken down across 9 different courses. The EMCR master's degree has 4 different steps to it: a core curriculum coming from the disciplines in which I shared, and methods and field specializations that span the university, offering more than 120 different elective options for students to choose a pathway depending on what they'd like their field specialization to be and what skills they need in order to get a job in which they've identified. We will also have graduate capstone opportunities where our students work in teams and work with community partners. Some of you might be out there today, to forward and create a lasting asset or a deliverable for them that enhances their mission and provides our students experience. We also want our program to cater to practitioners that are coming back to school and that can enhance their existing jobs and think about ways they can feed our program directly back into their experiences and affiliations. And that's for our graduate certificate and our master's program. We also offer a non-degree professional certificate that provides community members, business owners, nonprofit folks representing the public sector, private sector, in order to have an experience with some of our curriculum and have a menu from it to taste in order, if they'd like to use it as a ladder into our graduate curriculum, they can. And they also get some of our best and brightest in terms of content that we share in our core curriculum that we've incubated and that we feel thematically is a different focus in education, where students and practitioners can think thematically rather than disciplinarily to solve some of the world's most complex problems. Our faculty conducts research locally and globally, and we draw upon these connections, experiences, and lessons learned. That's what this speaker series is all about, is to have folks get a little bit of a taste of what our faculty has to offer and what our students will get in the core. It's something completely unique at Portland State to offer a core curriculum coming from so many different disciplines and fed by so many different elective options that students can cater to their own interests. We also want to integrate community partners into our curriculum. We will have speaker series, opportunities and educational opportunities for our students to connect directly with community partners, practitioners that work in this field and can understand what the opportunities are, the jobs are, and the way that they're traversing to fulfill those goals that they have. So for those passionate about solving some of the world's most timely and complicated problems, this new pathway might be for you. Portland State's program is one of the only in the United States that connects directly emergency management to community resilience. And community resilience is one of our #1 strengths that we have here at Portland State, and through our community-based learning and our applied research faculty. And Portland State truly does serve in this area, and we're focusing our strengths in order to serve at a timely opportunity to respond to things that are going to be increasing with frequency in our future, such as wildfires, such as what we've learned with public health, in addition to waiting for those hazards that come that have catastrophic impacts like earthquakes. So please think about starting your journey with us. Think about EMCR and ICDR as resources for you to come to learn, and also for us to broaden your organizations and offer value for the community. So we look forward to hearing more from you. Now I'm excited to share with you our talk for today, Communicating Science and Risk by Dr. Brianne Suldovsky, and Communicating Health and Risk by Dr. Lauren Frank. Our idea today is to have 2 back-to-back talks that are interwoven with each other, and then have a question and answer facilitated at the end. Please put your questions and answers in the Q&A portion instead of the chat. Dr. Brianne Suldovsky is an assistant professor in communication at Portland State University who specializes in science communication and public engagement. Her research examines public engagement with scientific and environmental issues, including climate change, air pollution, and biotechnology. As an associate professor in communication, Dr. Lauren Frank specializes in public health, mass media, and risk communication. She collaborates with multiple nonprofit organizations on public health campaigns, and her research examines how social interactions affect health choices. We're very excited to announce that she co-edited Entertainment Education Behind the Scenes Case Studies in Theory and Practice, which is out this month. And I'm sure you'll hear a little bit about it in her talk. So please join me today in welcoming Brianne and Lauren. And Brianne is going to start us today. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. So today I will be talking about communicating science and risk. Get my slides up here for you. So I will be covering kind of the psychology of risk perception, so how people can think about and perceive risks, offering some best practices for communicating about risks, and then discussing kind of the lingering challenges that risk communicators face. Before I do all of that, I do want to note that it's rare that we have a one-size-fits-all approach, and so the concepts I'll be talking today, while applicable in a broad array of risk contexts, it's very important to consider your publics and the types of things you're trying to aim for when you're communicating about risks. So a risk is the probability of damage multiplied by the seriousness of the damage. And when we communicate about risks to public groups, typically we're looking to persuade people to either modify their behavior, to reduce their risk, or to modify the way that they think about or approach a risk. Examples of risk communication include things like smoking cessation campaigns, pro-vaccination communication, and climate change campaigns. So the risks that harm people and the risks that people are actually upset about are typically very different, right? Some people will see risks as very high when in actuality they're not, and some people will not see a risk when in actuality their risk is very high. So how do people go about perceiving risks that are around them? So I'm going to talk about 6 different factors that influence the way that people think about and understand risk. First and foremost is availability. So events and risks that are accessible or easily remembered leads to an overestimation of frequency and an overestimation of risk. For example, if you ask people what type of power generation they see as most risky, many people will tell you that nuclear power scares them, that they see it as a risk. When in actuality, we know that coal, for example, kills an estimation, if you're looking at the risk in terms of death per kilowatt hour produced, Coal is 14 times deadlier than nuclear power. Hydroelectric power is 14 times deadlier than nuclear power. And yet, when we do public opinion surveys, we see that nuclear power ranks among people's most riskiest perceived power generation, because nuclear disasters are available, right? They create big events that are easily accessible and remembered for people. Another factor is conformity. We rely on our peer groups and our social groups to tell us what is and is not risky. We see this playing out with COVID-19, where people are relying on their social groups to understand the risks that they're facing. You can see from the Pew Research Center, the chart on the screen shows that there is a partisan divide, for example, in how Americans view COVID-19, whether or not they see it as a major threat. And we see people kind of retreating into their political camps, where Democrats are seeing it as a much higher risk than Republicans are. And we see this pattern time and time again, especially with issues like climate change, where people are relying on those around them to get a sense of how risky something is. Also, the third factor is overconfidence. Humans tend to have what's called an optimism bias when thinking about a risk. So we typically see ourselves as able to mitigate risk, or we see ourselves as less susceptible to risk than we are, particularly for risks we feel like we have control over. So some studies show that for driving, for example, we tend to underestimate the risk we face when we drive in a car. And some studies have even shown that the people who drive the most recklessly have the highest optimism bias. And so people who are actually at most risk see themselves at the least risk. The fourth factor is confirmation bias. So we typically, humans, we like to ignore evidence that conflicts with what we already believe. And we tend to interpret new information based on what we already think, and to kind of reaffirm our pre-existing beliefs. We see this a lot in the gun control debate, for example. When a mass shooting occurs, people who believe there should be more gun control will say, this is a gun problem. People who do not think that we should have more gun control will say, we actually just need more good guys with guns. And so when we see a risk, we typically interpret that risk and make it so that it falls in line with what we already believe and what we already think. We also display an aversion to uncertainty. So public groups want absolutes, which risk professionals cannot provide. We saw this play out over the last 12 months with the mask debate. When COVID-19 started, the recommendation was, don't worry about wearing a mask. We're not that confident it protects you. The more experts learned about how COVID-19 spread, the more masks were being recommended. And so people would sometimes interpret that information as, well, the experts don't know what they're talking about, because uncertainty exists in all risk communication situations. And finally, people are very reluctant to change. Our strong beliefs, when it comes to risk perception, are steadfast. They hold firm. We see this a lot in climate change communication, for example. People who are climate skeptics or don't think that climate change exists are far less likely to say that extreme weather in their area exists. This holds true where, if you look at like national surveys in the United States, if you ask people about what the weather in their local area, what they'll tell you about their weather is far more indicative of their climate change beliefs than it is about actual weather. We conducted a study in Oregon that looked at Oregonians' climate change beliefs and measured the weather in their zip code, and we found no correlation. So we surveyed over 1,000 people and found absolutely no relationship between people's actual weather patterns and their beliefs about those weather patterns. And when people experience extreme weather, they are much more likely to interpret whether or not it is extreme through their existing climate change beliefs. So if I'm a climate skeptic, I will say, no, it hasn't been hotter than average, even if it has. If I believe in climate change, I will say, oh, it's been so much warmer than average, even if it hasn't. People also interpret risk events typically under stress. And when humans are under stress, we don't make the best judgments. And so when under stress, which is common in risk communication contexts, people process information in very unique ways. Our ability to process information is impaired. We have a reduced ability to hear, understand, and remember information. Typically, studies show that people can really only attend to 1 to 3 messages at a time when they're undergoing stress. We also process information at 4 or more levels below our education level when we're trying to intake information in a stressful environment. People typically focus on what we hear first and last. And so if we're given a lot of information, we forget the vast majority of it and really just remember what was first said and what was said at the end of a risk message. So people are messy. We're not great judges of risk. So what does that mean for how we should be communicating about risk and how we should be reaching out to public groups? There's 3 best practices I'm going to talk about today. The first is know your audience. And I cannot stress this enough. Knowing who your audience is, what they believe, what barriers they face is vital if you're going to meaningfully communicate with them about the risks that they face. To know your audience, there are a few different ways to do this. I'm going to talk about demographics, looking at their current risk perceptions, and being mindful of their social and structural context. So demographics. Some of the studies in risk communication have shown that education level, wealth and income, gender or sex, age, and race and ethnicity can all influence not only how susceptible we are to risk, but also how we process and think about risk and how able we are to respond to them. For example, for education level, and this is actually on an international scale, the biggest predictor of believing in climate change is education level. So what education level you are dealing with can greatly impact how your audience or how your public is thinking about the risk. Wealth and income is also a major factor in risk perception. So wealth can influence what risks people actually see as risks. It can also influence how able they are to respond to those risks. For example, people who are very wealthy that live along the coast typically are less worried about sea level rise because they can just build a different house. Whereas people who do not have as much wealth are more worried about things like sea level rise because they are less able to respond to it. In terms of gender and sex, typically for most risks, we see what's called a white male effect, where males are typically see things as less risky than their female counterparts. So this study on the screen just looked at risk perceptions of smoking and found that women see smoking as a much higher risk than men. And we see this pattern time and time again in risk communication contexts, really across the board in all sorts of different contexts, where women typically see risks as higher and men typically see risks as lower. Age is another thing to pay attention to. Age affects not only what risks people are likely to face and what risks they are likely to be worried about, but also how to communicate with them about those risks. So this chart on your screen is from the Pew Research Center showing trends in social media use by age group. So you can see the line at the very bottom are people 65 plus. You're only dealing with like 30% of people that have a social media page when they're in that age group, compared to over 85% of people who are 18 to 29. So understanding the basic age demographics of your public can inform a lot in terms of what they're likely thinking, what they're likely afraid of, and how to reach them about those risks. And that brings us to race and ethnicity. So mentioning the white male effect again, typically whites see risks as much lower across the board and non-whites see them as much higher. So racial and ethnic disparities exist in all sorts of risk contexts. The CDC has noted, for example, race and ethnic disparities in COVID-19 risk, where BIPOC communities are significantly more likely to be at risk to COVID, so to not only be exposed to COVID, but to contract COVID, and then much more likely to have serious health consequences as a result of being exposed to COVID. In addition to demographics, understanding your audience's current risk perceptions are key. So 2 of the major factors of risk perception is threat and efficacy. So threat refers to whether or not I see something as a risk and whether or not I think I personally am susceptible to that risk. Efficacy is basically whether or not I think I can do anything about it. So there's 2 types of efficacy. Self-efficacy is whether or not I can actually take action. So am I capable of taking action? Response efficacy is, do I think my action will actually reduce my risk? So is the action going to be effective in reducing my risk? Understanding how your public or how your audience is thinking about the threat dimensions and efficacy dimensions of your risk is invaluable. It is such incredibly helpful information to have. When audiences see risks with high threat and high efficacy, people enter into what's called a danger control response. They actually go to mitigate, they take action to mitigate their risk. However, when you have high threat and low efficacy, people engage in what's called a fear control response. So instead of controlling their exposure to a risk or the likelihood that they'll experience a risk, if they have low efficacy paired with high threat, what we do is we actually try to address our fear as opposed to addressing the actual risk. We saw this with COVID. People who saw the threat of COVID but didn't think they could adequately protect themselves, instead of actually trying to mitigate their risk, what they did instead is tried to lower their fear about the risk. And if you have no threat perception at all, so if an audience or a public doesn't see a threat, they're unlikely to take any response. And so perceptions of threat and efficacy can be mismatched. So there are some risks for which the threat is very high, but your public might see it as very low, or vice versa. So knowing what the current risk perceptions are in terms of threat and efficacy can be incredibly helpful if you're trying to adjust risk perceptions, either to increase threat, reduce threat, or increase efficacy. Another aspect of understanding current risk perceptions that is incredibly helpful is knowing how your public views other risks. So when you're communicating about the risk at hand, you can make connections to that existing risk perception. We see this with climate change communication, for example. It is very likely that most publics in the United States are going to see smoking as a big risk, right? A big cancer risk. So if you can tie the risk you want to communicate about with a risk people already perceive and accept, the better off you'll be. So in this ad, you can see it says scientists are as certain that humans are changing the climate as they are that smoking kills. The third aspect of understanding your audience is social and structural barriers. So it's great to understand demographics. It's invaluable to understand current risk perceptions. It's also incredibly important that you are very familiar with the social and structural barriers that your audience is facing, because you need to make sure they are actually able to take action, that they have the skills necessary to take action, and that they have the resources that they need. So best practice number 2 is using what you know about your audience to tailor your communication and engagement with that audience. So once you know your audience, you can tailor your communication, tailor your approach to be responsive to demographic trends and needs, to increase or decrease threat perceptions, depending on what your risk is and what you're looking to do, to emphasize efficacy information to make sure that your public is empowered to do something about the risk, and to address real and perceived social and structural barriers. So best practice number 3, be familiar with the communication environment. Communication does not exist in a vacuum. Communication environments are increasingly competitive and increasingly difficult to break through. So understanding what types of communication your audience or your public is exposed to is vital. This includes what news media are they consuming? What social media are they consuming? What are their social networks? What type of popular culture are they consuming? Knowing those things can help you understand what your communication environment is and respond accordingly, because you are not going to be the only source of information for your public. And so knowing what type of information they have access to is incredibly helpful. Some additional tips to communicating about risks. Be first. The first source of information about a risk is typically the preferred source for a public. Be right. Include what you do know and what you don't know. Be very transparent and honest with your audience about what is currently understood and what is currently not understood. Be credible. Honesty and truthfulness are key if you want your public to continue to come to you for risk information. Be consistent. Repeat your message multiple times. The more often you can repeat a message, the more likely it is your public is going to remember and learn from that message. Promote action and promote efficacy. Tell people what they can do or what you are doing to mitigate the risk for them. Giving people threat information without accompanying it with efficacy information does nothing but scare people and motivates them to engage in a fear control response, which you don't want. You want people to engage in a danger control response, which requires that efficacy piece. It requires that your audience understands what they can do and how effective the actions they're able to take will be. Be concise and focused. Short, to the point messages are best, especially in high stress risk environments. The more concise you can be, the better. And finally, express empathy and respect your audience. Understanding where your audience comes from is great. It is even better if you can understand and empathize with that perspective. And some don'ts. So what to avoid in risk communication? Avoid technical jargon as much as you can. Avoid condescending or judgmental tones or phrases, going back to the empathy piece. Do not attack a person or an organization. Do not make promises you cannot deliver. And that feeds back to making sure you are very clear with your audience or your public what you know and what you don't know. Do not offer speculation and do not offer humor. Studies have shown that sources of risk information who try to use humor in their engagement and communication approach are seen as less trustworthy and less credible, and they are less likely to be gone back to for information. So some of the lingering challenges in risk communication. Maintaining risk salience is incredibly difficult. Audiences and publics are faced with a bunch of risks all at once, and they need to make decisions about which risks they're going to focus on. And so communicating early and communicating often is key in order to maintain risk salience for the risk you are communicating about. Breaking through crowded information environments. Be mindful about the other risk messages your audience is exposed to and what type of voices you're competing with in that communication environment. Battling misinformation and planning for inoculation is challenging. So inoculation from a communication and persuasion standpoint means that you are kind of communicating about misinformation before the misinformation gets to someone. That's typically been shown one of the most reliable ways to make sure that people aren't persuaded by misinformation. So knowing your communication environment and what type of misinformation your audience or your public might be exposed to is incredibly helpful if you're going to engage in battling misinformation and being a salient and relevant competing voice. Thank you so much.
Hi, folks. Thank you very much for your time. I'm going to continue on, and in a lot of ways, my presentation really is continuing, building off of some of what Brianne just talked to us about in terms of risk perception, and I'll be applying it particularly to public health communication and campaigns right now during COVID-19. So my background is in both public health and in communication, and a lot of the research that I do is looking at how we do specific campaigns. So in some ways, this is very similar to and builds off of everything that Brianne was just talking about, because we really want to know our audience. We really want to then think about different audiences and segment them carefully, and then adapt our messages to the audiences that we're trying to reach. In other ways, though, a lot of what we do with campaigns tends to be thought out well in advance and very much in that prevention and preparation portion of a disaster cycle. But then a crisis happens. And so a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is an idea of how can we take what we already know, all of the formative research and other steps that we've taken to try to get to know our audience and try to build infrastructure for campaigns, to then adapt and be able to reach our audience rapidly in the moment as we have an unfolding crisis. Now, as Brianne discussed, when we're talking about risks, we often misperceive them. And in particular, as we're talking about COVID-19, they have all of the things going on that we would expect to lead to lots of misperception of risk. So it was brand new, and novelty means that we tend to misperceive risk. It has tons of scientific uncertainty as scientists are learning at the same time as we are. And there have been mixed messages in a variety of ways in terms of who we can trust, who are appropriate sources. And that can lead to a lot of difficulties in terms of what we actually say is accurate and how we deal with misinformation. I think we've all probably seen a lot of misinformation in this realm. And so when we're talking about a crisis, we do want to absolutely know our audience and be able to take care of and capitalize on as much as possible things we already know about the channels that they're using, the values that they have, the kinds of content and messages that tend to reach people well. We also want to be very thoughtful about the ways in which we build trust and credibility. So we want to be aware of who is a trusted source for the particular audiences that we're talking to. And we also, of course, want to be quite aware of ways in which we can adapt existing infrastructure so that we can use it in the moment, because in a crisis, we don't have much time to be able to roll out something new. In a perfect world, we'd have tons of time for doing all sorts of research and learning those great things about our audience and adapting our messages. But we have to be really, really fast when something brand new is happening and we need to get messaging out quickly. We'll also talk a little bit about how to think long-term, because of course, COVID-19 is a bit different than a lot of the crises that we've dealt with in the past in public health because of how long it's been running. And so we are still absolutely in that crisis phase. And yet, usually we think of crises being much more acute, where it ends and then we think about lessons learned and how we can adapt for the next crisis, rather than on the fly trying to continue adapting as we're going on. So as we talk today, I'm going to be thinking through and showing you some of the different kinds of campaigns that have adapted and used existing infrastructure. I'll also be highlighting both ones that I've worked on and ones that are from around the world. So this first example is one that was highly innovative and came out in March of last year very rapidly. It was from the government of Vietnam. Some of you may have had a chance to see it. And in this campaign, they actually used a TikTok video. So they worked with a variety of local TikTok stars, people who already had that social media platform. And they chose that platform because it is a place where a lot of their audience already was. So this is really using that idea of know your audience, going to where they already are. It looked like something that people would just use and interact with for fun anyways on TikTok, a very standard format of a choreography. So on TikTok, one of the things that happens is with these short little videos, people will have the same music and then they'll film themselves doing a specific dance. Others can then duet that by filming themselves doing exactly the same dance to the same music and share it, and it can end up going viral and being spread amongst lots of people. That's exactly what this campaign did. And at first glance, it just looks like a normal choreography dance, but when you look more closely, you see that what they actually were doing in it was demonstrating all of the appropriate techniques for hand washing. So the World Health Organization has a list of hand positions and ways in which we should all wash our hands. It goes beyond just the wash our hands for 20 seconds and talks about getting between each finger and turning our hands over and all sorts of different things. And so they choreographed those steps with other steps into a video, and it got lots of play as others copied it and then shared it with their friends. And this is particularly successful because it also plays on those issues around trust and credibility. So sometimes we don't believe official sources, but we're more likely to believe our friends and others who we already have established relationships with. In something like TikTok, if I'm already following people and then they are the ones sending the message, the source isn't just that official source, it's also my social network and my friends and peers, and so I can pick up habits from them. Now, unfortunately, misinformation can spread in the same way, and so one of the key things that we know is it's important that agencies are on these platforms and developing these kinds of campaigns to be part of that conversation so that they aren't ignoring it. About in October, I went looking on TikTok for the CDC, and they did not yet have their own TikTok that was spreading similar information. World Health Organization did, a lot of other international agencies did, but it took a while for some agencies to get onto platforms that are being used to spread health information already. As Brianne showed us, there are also some deep disparities in terms of who uses what kind of technologies. So this was a great example of a campaign that leveraged TikTok, but that's for a very particular audience. And so we know that in a lot of places, not everybody has access to social media. And in fact, not everybody has access to the internet. And so this is a really different example of a campaign where I've been working with them on some of the evaluation and what happened and how quickly they were able to roll out. I work with an organization called Peripheral Vision International, and they're established in Uganda, but also in other countries around Africa and Southeast Asia. They work with another organization called Viamo using interactive voice technology. And so what this does is understand and acknowledge that in a lot of places, very few people have access to the internet. And the most common communication technology are things like these, really simple feature phones, and people can get them, they share them amongst family members. If they have access to electricity, the first thing that people will get and charge is their cell phones, and there are lots of charging stations all over. And so Viamo has partnered with the telecom companies across many countries in order to provide a free service where people who call in don't get charged for the minutes or time. That's all paid for by the telecommunication companies. And they're able to get information. Because this is already established and people know that calling these numbers gives them health information, that could be readily used very rapidly during COVID-19. These interactive technologies are also good because they rely on voice technology. So they don't presume literacy or other more fancy technologies. Instead, it's almost like a choose your own adventure. There's a script and you call in and they'll read something to you and then you choose a number or say back one word to choose which part of the script you'll hear next. And so this technology can be used for giving all sorts of information in a sort of storytelling version, or for doing quizzes and other kinds of tests of knowledge, or for just providing straight information. They mobilized very quickly so that by March 13th, they had the first script up in English about COVID-19 and then translated it to a variety of other languages so that it was available in all the major local dialects. And they had this rolled out by April. The script included information on what COVID-19 was, more information on how to do social distancing, why to stay home, how to wash hands, all of the different kinds of myth busting that needed to be happening at the time, and anyone who wanted to could call for free. Originally, this was available in April in Ghana, Madagascar, Malawi, Nepal, Uganda, and then it expanded in May to Indonesia and Mali as well. Over the months since then, hundreds of thousands of callers have called in each country to get this information for free and be able to, at any time, call back, repeat, share the phone with others, and get information and learn more about COVID-19. So this is using those existing partnerships to try and really take advantage of rapidly getting information out through a source that's already trusted, already well known, already used a great deal. Much of my work has been in entertainment education. And entertainment education is a particular type of health campaign where what we do is we pair entertaining media, most commonly it's long-running soap operas and telenovelas, with educational information. So it's the intentional placement of educational content in entertainment messages. In the US, the example that we think of most frequently is something like Sesame Street. And so this has a long history here in the US where we think about something that kids like to watch and would choose to watch for fun anyways. And then it's also meant to be educational. But we also think about entertainment education being for adults and not just for children. And the reason is because particularly when we work with storytelling, we can do a lot of things that overcome our general resistance to new information or the ways in which we might counter argue against being told what to do. So often in health campaigns, if I just put out a public service announcement and tell everybody, hey, you should wear a mask, we're going to have some subset of people who, when they hear that, are going to react very badly against it and not like being told what to do. What happens with an entertainment education narrative is that kind of information can end up being embedded within a story so that we're watching and we become really keen on knowing the characters and liking them and wanting to be like them. And then we see them demonstrate various behaviors in a way that can help us actually feel like we could do it too. And so it gets at that self-efficacy piece that we know is so important in terms of response. It can also get at that susceptibility piece. If I see people who are very like me ending up facing a risk, then that can help overcome barriers of optimism bias where I might feel like, oh, it could never happen to me, but goodness, look, it happened to this character that I care about a great deal and who I've really strongly identified with. And so because I see that it can happen to them, my own perceived susceptibility might end up increasing. We saw that because we were in the midst of a pandemic, a lot of production shut down. Certainly that's been here in the United States, that we saw a lot of television was immediately shut down. Entertainment education was able to adapt very rapidly and start getting new campaigns out with innovative ways, taking what they already knew about the audience, what they already knew about the format, and to the fact that they were already long running and well trusted in order to try and get COVID-19 information that was accurate out as quickly as possible. And so here in the US, one primary example is Sesame Street. And they did a special where they invited all sorts of celebrities in addition to their own people and made it set up looking like what we're doing right now with a Zoom call, where everybody was able to be remote. And so in doing so, they were providing information, but they were also role modeling the idea of staying home and maintaining social distance. In other countries, entertainment education doesn't always use television. And so this is an example in Mozambique where they have had a long-running radio drama that people have been listening to since 2015. And what they did is, as soon as COVID-19 happened, they already were established as having regular episodes that people could listen to, and those episodes were followed each time with a call-in show where they'd have on health experts. So rather than halt production, what they did is simply switch up production to have it such that each voice was recorded individually. They'd never have people overlap in the studio. Instead, one person would go in and record, and then the next person would go in and record, so that they were able to safely maintain production. They were able to rapidly get new scripts created and approved by the Ministry of Health, and get people from the Ministry of Health to join the call-in shows. And so immediately they were able to have new information out and have that two-way exchange where people already trusted, already tuned in weekly, could then call in afterwards and ask about COVID-19. In the original months right following, they had more than 500 unique questions about COVID-19 asked and answered live. And they also used their Facebook group to end up repeating the information, adding more to it, and then providing additional resources to anyone who had connected to them on Facebook. Similarly, the Teacup Diaries is a radio show that has been running since 2015 in Myanmar. It typically focuses on interethnic conflict. And there's a tea shop at the heart of it where people come together and chat with each other, and everyone knows each other well and gets along and starts dealing with who's going to marry whom and all sorts of different questions. When COVID-19 started, they immediately adopted the scripts so that the tea shop itself actually closed down. So this storyline completely changed such that people were then having negotiations around, well, what's safe and can we actually see each other and how do we deal with this? And they did it in a way that felt really real and authentic, where they showed people struggling with their mental health, with the ability to make money and economic implications and all of the things that people were going through, so that they could actually get better information out there, but also help people cope with the other consequences of the shutdown. They similarly have a Facebook page, and it has over 1 million followers. So what they did is use that Facebook page to add additional information, but they had a focus on digital literacy as part of that. So any viewers who also did have access to social media and also were tied into Facebook were getting information about how to sort out real truth and facts versus all of the misinformation or fake news that they were hearing about online in terms of the pandemic. And since people already trusted the cast and already trusted this source of information, they went to it and learned about digital literacy and became more likely to share accurate information from official sources and less likely to share information from untrustworthy sources or to be participating in perpetuating myths. And I will do just the brief plug that my book is now out. It is all on entertainment education. And in particular, there are case studies in it on both of the last 2 radio dramas that I mentioned. So it's a free download, and I think the link is in the chat. If you're at all interested, we published it open access so that anyone around the globe would be able to have access to it. When we think about the disaster cycle, we also then want to think about that. What do we do with lessons learned and next steps as we start planning for the next time we're facing a major disaster? And so this science show is one example of what we're doing in terms of that. It's called Engine, and what it is doing is working particularly on promoting STEM, so science and technology, and in particular focusing on girls' role in science and technology and engineering and math. It's produced in Africa and is shown there. And the first season was already contracted and ready to go before the pandemic began, but they rapidly adjusted it so that it not only highlighted that women can become scientists and was empowering in those ways, but it also serves to start showing the scientific process and is intentionally trying to demonstrate ways in which that scientific process leads to uncertainty and ways in which we can understand hypotheses and hypothesis testing and what proof means and how scientific consensus is come to and then also might change over time. And so the idea is that over time, this kind of programming might help us in terms of better understanding risk information. So we've just gotten funding and are going to be airing a 2nd season this summer and doing an evaluation to see, does this actually work or not? So that's our next steps in terms of thinking long term. And thank you very much for your time.
Okay, thank you very much. This is Hirohito. I'm a professor of economics and the chair of the economics department at PSU. I'm also a co-founder and co-director for of the initiatives for community and disaster resilience. ICDR is co-organizing today's event and other speaker series with EMCR. So I'm gonna handle the question and answers session, but before that, let me just talk about ICDR just for 1 minute. While I'm talking, you can send me or send us questions through the Q&A function, not the chat function. Okay, so Professor Masami Nishishiba and myself have founded ICDR in 2017. Our mission is to provide a forum where experts from the academia, the government sector, and non-profit or for-profit organizations can exchange information on and discuss emergency management, disaster preparedness, and other disaster-related topics. Since its creation, ICDR has focused on 2 activities. The first is the lecture series. We have organized many lectures inviting both local and international experts. Starting this year, we have joined EMCR and now jointly organize the speaker series. The second is to organize the field trip course at PSU. The highlight of this course is to go to the Tohoku area where a 9.1 magnitude earthquake and massive tsunami happened on March 11th, 2011, and killed about 18,000 people and destroyed hundreds of thousands of buildings and communities. Professor Nishishiba and myself have visited the region several times with PSU students and community members of Oregon and Portland. We have interacted with local people and survivors in Tohoku. Last month, Masami and I had an opportunity to give a talk on the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami that happened exactly 10 years before that day, before March 11th. We will continue to talk about what happened in Tohoku, what kind of policies worked or didn't work, and what are the lessons for us when we also face the risk of experiencing the big one. Okay, so this is what the ICDR is, and let me take a look at the questions you sent us. Okay, so here's a question for Brianna. Regarding demographics of perception, how do cross relations between these factors influence their importance?
That is such an excellent question. The short answer is yes, it absolutely does. And so paying attention to the intersectionality of demographic variables is really vital. I can give an example from my own work. So in climate change communication, one of the areas I'm an expert in, we talk a lot about political polarization. So assuming, political ideology, seeing it as a demographic. So if you're dealing with a conservative public, you typically think, okay, well, they're more likely to be climate skeptical. They're less likely to accept climate change. If you're dealing with a liberal group, you might think more likely to accept climate change. When we looked at climate perceptions in Oregon, we found that to be true, not surprising. But when we looked at the racial differences between people, so if you look at whites, if you define 2 groups of people, whites and non-white, political polarization was way more common in white groups than it was for BIPOC people that we surveyed. Out of, for example, like the 30 survey questions we looked at, whites were politically polarized on 27 of them, whereas non-whites were only politically polarized on something like 4. And so looking at how those demographic trends intersect is incredibly important and very meaningful.
Thanks very much. All right, the next question. Do you have any advice or insight into how we can shift the perception of risk after people have already formed first impressions that may not accurately reflect reality?
That's a big question. I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Frank first to address that. It is a persistent and ongoing challenge, especially because beliefs are typically slow to change for people.
Yeah, so definitely difficult. And that's why Brianne, Dr. Suldovsky mentioned the idea of try to be first and try to get out there early and try to do some inoculation against misinformation. That is not always possible. And especially we know there is a lot of political polarization. There are a lot of things where we already have strongly anchored beliefs and we are wrong. So some of the answer is that it is a slow iterative process. And so trying to do it all at once is not going to end up working. If I try to tell somebody that they're completely wrong, it's likely to backfire and highly unlikely to actually lead to any attitude change. Some of this can work well in dialogue if we're having conversations with each other, where part of the answer is that I'm listening and not just talking at somebody, but having good conversations about where they're coming from, why they believe what they believe. The other answer, and this is part of why I spoke on entertainment education, is sometimes we can do different kinds of campaigns and messaging where we're trying to sort of bypass people's real core beliefs. So to the extent that I'm going to filter everything I hear through my existing beliefs, and I have this idea of confirmation bias where I'm listening to you and I hear something and I say, well, clearly you're just wrong, and I shut it out. Other kinds of messaging can often bypass that. And that's why things like storytelling can be really, really helpful, because I don't tend to listen with that part of my brain. I'm not sitting there saying, well, you're wrong when I'm watching television. I'm instead saying, huh, cool story. And I'm listening and I'm following along and all of that. And so it makes it more likely that I can slowly change my attitudes, slowly get new information. Notice though, in both of these ways I'm talking about, slowly is a big part of it. It is very, very challenging to change existing strongly held beliefs.
And to build off of that, I think focusing on dialogue and listening is really key, and expressing empathy and honest empathy for your audience or your public is also incredibly important. Some studies, for example, that look at physician and patient communication about vaccines and vaccine hesitancy has shown that the more that physicians can listen to and authentically validate the feelings and perspectives of their patients, and the more they can emphasize shared value systems. So things like, you're worried about your children's health, so am I. We are on the same page, we have the same goal. And emphasizing those kind of shared outcomes in that dialogic format can be really helpful.
Okay, good. All right, the next question I think can be another challenging one. So thank you very much for your presentations. A challenge I'm seeing among emergency managers and disasters or natural hazard recovery practitioners is how to balance communications about COVID-19 amid other hazards such as tornadoes, floods, and so forth. Any suggestions for how to effectively communicate about multiple disasters simultaneously?
Yeah, so this is another hard one. I like these questions. One of the things that the CDC and others went to a few years ago was talking about an all hazards approach. And so this is pre-COVID-19, but thinking through how do we simultaneously message on tornadoes, wildfires, earthquakes, etc. To do that well, typically what we do is focus on particular behaviors that are useful across a variety of different kinds of hazards. And in particular, that includes things like having a well-stocked emergency kit, or being willing to listen to advice from authorities to stay home and shelter in place. So some of that early on in the pandemic could actually translate into COVID-19 as well, because things like having a well-stocked emergency kit can mean having access to being able to have hand sanitizer and other kinds of things. Some of the ideas around sheltering in place can translate to stay home orders, though they are not the same, because sheltering in place literally means in an acute, immediate emergency, staying wherever you are versus staying home as much as possible. So some of that messaging for COVID-19 could lean on previous messaging and try to use that. But in other ways, and especially now as we're further into the pandemic, it can feel like a conflict. It can feel like, if I'm supposed to be staying home and a tornado is coming, how do I get to a shelter? And so some of that is about being really honest and transparent about which risk is biggest at that moment. And so if there is an imminent tornado, being very clear and consistent on, yes, we want you to shelter in place if you are able to, but if you do not have a safe place, then even though it would be best practice to not come, you should still come to our emergency shelter. And in order for those kinds of messages to work well, they have to be very, very honest throughout. I think where we run into problems is when we pretend that we know more about which risk is bigger, or when we start contradicting ourselves, because then we lose our credibility for future messaging as well. But there isn't a simple answer, because especially in an acute moment where we're facing multiple risks, we are balancing those. And public health officials, we're balancing them just as much as the public is.
Okay. Any other comments? Okay, all right. So I guess balancing act is quite important. So the next question is, when it comes to very large or long-term hazards, such as climate change or earthquakes, it seems like most of the people who recognize these risks exist still don't take actions to reduce personal or social risk. How do you approach these long-term and large-scale risks differently than short-term risks? Thank you. So this is the question.
Yeah, so that's a really great question. It's a lot harder. Both it's harder because we tend not to want to make changes that feel further out. They don't feel as real. We tend to perceive risks as being much more alarming and severe if they are near term than if they are long term. Additionally, it's not just that length of time that's different there. It's also that question of how much I can do something about the risk. So Brianne talked about this idea of self-efficacy and response efficacy, and that feeling that I can do something that will make a difference in risk being really important in terms of motivating me to actually take action. The problem is that for long-term things like climate change, we often don't feel that self-efficacy because it is more of a collective issue. So it can feel like my individual choices and my individual actions don't make a big difference. For those, we tend to need instead to take a different model where we're talking about the collective. And it does become about community and community resilience. So this beautifully ties into this new degree program that we have, because it is about focusing on communities and neighborhoods and how together we can do things rather than emphasizing individual level changes. And that is not something that we've seen adequately yet in the messaging around those. And I think hopefully we'll actually take some lessons learned from COVID-19, because it has been so clear how much it's about community level action that relates to the waves of the pandemic and community spread, that maybe we'll be able to use that for messaging around things like climate change on the community level.
Well, it sounds like it's sort of related to one of the research works I've been doing, which is the disaster insurance. It's very difficult to find the right value for the insurance if the probability of earthquake is not calculable. And also, it's very difficult to educate people about the importance of disaster insurance, because there's what they call disaster myopia. So people try to, or people tend to discount the risk of huge events like earthquakes, so that insurance appears to be more expensive than the kind of a right value. So I think educating people so that they can make a right decision can be quite a challenging thing. Right. I guess this is the last question. Is highlighting the benefits of risk mitigation, such as health outcomes or jobs, help overcome the aversion to cost of risk mitigation?
In some ways, yes. In other ways, maybe not. So highlighting the benefits of a risk mitigation behavior can be, outside of just like addressing that risk, can be really helpful, assuming people have that response efficacy piece where they think it's actually going to be effective at reducing that risk as well. The risk and benefit relationship typically looks like when people are looking at a risk, they see something as riskier if there's also no benefit attached. So benefits absolutely can help, but you also need to make sure people can actually still engage in that behavior, address the barriers they face in engaging that behavior, and factors like that as well.
Okay. Dr. Frank, any comment?
I'll let Bree take that one.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. So thank you so much for attending this event. So let me pass this over to Jeremy.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for joining us today. I hope you felt this was an enriching seminar and also showing the breadth of the EMCR and ICDR programs and how all the different perspectives that feed our knowledge base. So thank you for joining us. Please join us for our next talk on May 6th, Toward a Resilient Urban Forest by Dr. Vivek Chandis. I also encourage you to return to the website that you registered, and there are uploads of the videos of each talk. You'll also receive a video link for those. Thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing you next time.